Good morning, folks. It's time for us to begin our class. Hey, like that countdown. The ones online can't see that, but we appreciate those who are watching the live stream. This morning we want to look at Joshua, chapters 9 and 10, and the story of the Gibeonites and the story of Adonai Zedek. These two, and of course there's a pretty big event there with Adonai Zedek that we'll get to as we go along. But as we begin in Joshua chapter 9, it came about, verse 1, when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland and all the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, heard of it, that is, the destruction of Jericho, Bethel, and Ai. They gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel. Now that's kind of a summary statement that kind of precedes or is a prelude to what's fixing to happen and the rest of the book, especially in chapter 10. But we got to get through with Gibeon before we get to that. But how much time elapsed between the fall of Jericho and the beginning of chapter 9? It took a week to take Jericho, and then probably some time to clean up after that. And then they took Bethel and Ai. That took a few days. And then they went to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. They built the altar there. They read the law. Most likely at this time, at Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, they actually at that point, while they were there, buried Joseph. You forgot about that, didn't you? You remember when Moses and all of Israel left Egypt, got out to the Red Sea, they were carrying the coffin of Joseph. When Joseph died, he required that he be buried in the land that his father had bought. Now, backing up in Genesis, when Jacob died in Egypt, they carried him back and buried him in the cave of Machpelah. Abraham bought that for Sarah. He and Sarah were buried there. Isaac and Rebekah were buried there. Leah was buried there before they went down to Canaan, and then Jacob was brought back and buried there. But then later when Joseph died, he said, when y'all leave, he anticipated the Exodus. When y'all leave, take me with you. And they had him mummified and put in the coffin, and they left carrying him, I guess, on a wagon, and carried him. Just imagine that, dragging this thing around for 40 years. You even think about that. We just kind of forget about Joseph and all this. But while they were there, somebody probably said, we're close to this area, the deed's over yonder. Let's go ahead and get this thing off our hands, and somebody get some shovels, let's dig a hole and take care of this. So probably at that point in time, in chapter 8, is when they buried Joseph. But how much time has transpired? As we read through this, we kind of get the 7 days of Jericho, because we see that every day they march around, so we can count to 7 pretty easy. But then how much time did the rest of this take? And so kind of be conscious of the time that's required as we go through all of this. And it reads like it happened in a few weeks. We're going to get to a point here that we can verify that it took a few years to do all of this. And so remember when they crossed the Jordan? Before they took Jericho, they celebrated the Passover. So that's in the spring of the year. Did they make this league with Gibeon in chapter 9 in the fall? Was it the next year? We really don't know. The process is here that the Bible writers are not time conscious like that. And I think something to be brought out by Tim in the study of John beginning today in the sermon series. The Gospel of John only deals with about 20 days of Jesus' life. Now, of a 3.5-year ministry, John handpicks about 20 days. And the wild thing is, chapters 13 through 21 of John deal with the last few days. Most of it, Thursday night, Friday, and the crucifixion. So all of that, John writes all of this, but just centers on just a little bit of time. So they're not time conscious. And so when we read through this, we don't catch how much time it takes for all this to occur. So when all these kings in all of these areas heard what Joshua and Israel had done, they began to gang together. In the meantime, the Gibeonites pulled this little stunt. So why did Gibeon seek peace with Israel? Let's read beginning verse 3. When the inhabitants of Gibeon, now Gibeon, okay, so here is Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim. They did the law thing there, went back to Gilgal at the main camp. But the people of Gibeon, which is over here on the other side, well, actually just a little bit farther north of Jerusalem, still part of this middle section of the country. And Gibeon was a proper city. When they heard what Joshua had done, verse 3, to Jericho and Ai, they also acted craftily and set out as envoys, took worn-out sacks on their donkeys, wineskins worn out and torn and mended, worn-out patched sandals on their feet, worn-out clothes on themselves, and the bread of their provision was dry and had become crumbled. How long did it take them to do that? We're going to prepare ourselves to deceive Israel. We're going to act like we've been traveling for a while. Did you go walk around town and say, have you got some old clothes? You got some old rags? We're looking for some worn-out sandals. Did they put an ad in the newspaper? We need worn-out clothes? Anybody got some week-old bread laying around? So they didn't just get up and say, hey, let's do this. Halloween's coming up. Some people have already started planning their Halloween costume. Kids especially. I know what I'm going to be at Halloween. So they're thinking about that in advance. Okay? So we got to work up a costume. So let's do this preparation. So it takes some time to do all that. Plus get some worn out donkeys. So verse 6, they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal. So that means they probably came near Jerusalem and hit the main road that led down to Jericho, the same one that the Good Samaritan traveled and the man that was beat up, the same one that Jesus followed from Jericho to Jerusalem, where he rode the donkey after he healed Bartimaeus and from his blindness, and maybe met with Zacchaeus and so forth. But all that happens right through there. So they take this road down to Gilgal, and when they got there, they said, we have come from a far country. Notice that nobody said which one. We come from a far country, and we want to make a covenant with you. And the men of Israel said to the Hivites, because they were a Hivite by nature, or by heritage, I guess we should say, but they didn't know they were Hivites. Now keep in mind here, the guys who came before and spied out the land, who may have recognized tribes and traditions and cultures, they're gone. And Joshua sent two guys from Shittim over here to spy out Jericho. Once they got into Gilgal, he sent out a couple to go up and check out Bethel and Ai, or several, we don't have many. But nobody has really gone throughout the land to see who the other people are. They're working on imperfect knowledge of who they're going to have to attack. And they're kind of waiting on God's direction to say, okay, this city's next. Go here next. And so they're waiting. So they said to the Hivites, how do we know that you are not from among us? And so verse 8, they said to Joshua, we are servants. Who are you? Where do you come from? Now we ask. Well, your servants have come from a very far country because the fame of the Lord your God, we have heard a report of him, all that he did in Egypt. Okay, so what far country? What we lose sight of, because our Bible story kind of deals with the land of Palestine only, we fail to realize that the news of what happened 40 years ago in Egypt has gone around the known world. The people in China knew about it. The people in what we think of as Spain knew about it. The people from Africa knew about it. Because the word had traveled through the caravans. And so people all over the world knew what God had done to Egypt. And these caravans that continually travel throughout, and even today, continue to travel throughout these countries, carry this news. They were the gossip fence, so to speak. They were the grapevine, literally, to carry news throughout the country. And when they stopped and set up their little bazaars in these towns or on these roads, the people who came and shopped, that's what they came for. They came for the news. They came for what's going on in the rest of the world. And so we've heard from a very far country. Which one? Well, now, they didn't pull out that world atlas and say, this one over here, because they didn't have that. So understand that we're dealing with people who are geographically not very mature. Kind of like a lot of people today have no sense of direction of where things are. And we've got a generation that don't know how to use a map, which is kind of interesting. And what's funny is there are people you can give directions and people you can't give directions to. I heard one girl said, give me landmarks. Tell me to turn by this store, okay? If you tell me to turn by Krispy Kreme, I know where that one's at, okay? I had an uncle, you asked him how to get somewhere and said, well, you go north 2.3 miles and then turn west. You had to have a compass and odometer. You asked his brother, oh, I'll go up beyond about as far as from here to that dog, turn left. Go out to that, once you pass that oak tree, there's one more house, go past that one. Okay, so you got to know your, all of that stuff. So it just depends on who you talk to. So they didn't really know which far country, and they didn't specify. They just said, we're from a far one. And so we've come from a far country because we heard of the fame of the Lord your God. Verse 10, all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, to Og, the king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. So our elders and the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, take your provisions in your hand for the journey and go meet them. Okay, now, if we've come from a far country, how long would it take the news of the destruction of this side of Canaan to reach them prepare, and then them leave and make this journey? Just for point of reference, it took Ezra 4 months to get from Shushan to Jerusalem. When Abraham was told, leave your father's country and go to land I will show you, he didn't get to Canaan the next day. It might have been a couple of years before he got there, because they didn't travel like we do. They traveled at a much different pace. Compared to our travel today, they moved so slow, the dust would settle on them by comparison. So understand that they didn't travel as fast as we do. So give them the time to make this journey. So we heard what happened. So our elders, verse 11, said, take provisions in your hand for the journey. Go meet them and say with them, we're your servants, make a covenant. So this our bread was warm when we took it out of the oven. And the wineskins, they were fresh. But now look at them. Our clothes were brand new. Our sandals were brand new. And they're worn out because of the journey. So the men of Israel, verse 14, took of their provisions. What did they do? Taste some of the bread, pick it up and feel of it, see how crumbly it was? I don't know. But they did not ask counsel of the Lord. So Joshua made peace with them, made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore an oath. So basically Joshua says, look guys, we're supposed to get all this area here. If you're beyond that area, we're not going to bother you. We'll make a covenant, without paying attention to really what was going on. So verse 16, at the end of 3 days, they probably had some feasting to do and some other parties like that. After 3 days, verse 16, they made a covenant with them, and they heard that they were neighbors, they were living within their land. Now, during that 3-day period, what happened? Did someone let it slip when we get back to Gibeon and somebody overheard that? Or did in this process, did Joshua send out some spies to go find the next place? And they came across Gibeon and found out these guys are from there? Did somebody drop their wallet, they picked up and saw their driver's license, got the address? We don't know. But somehow they found out they were local yokels. So verse 17, the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities on the 3rd day. Their cities were Gibeon, Shephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. It took 3 days to go from Gilgal to Gibeon. Now keep that in mind. Was it 3 full days? Or we start on Monday, get there on Wednesday? Okay, kind of play with that a minute because it's going to come up here shortly. That's going to be kind of strange. So the cities were Gibeon, Shephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. So right here, just on the western side of Jerusalem. The leaders of verse 18, the sons of Israel didn't strike them because the leaders of the congregation sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. Now bear in mind, when you say Israel, that's the same equal synonym to grumbling, because they did that the whole time that Moses led them. Now they do it with Joshua. Why did they grumble? Well, they had made a covenant with these people. Did they grumble because the covenant? Did they grumble because they didn't get the booty of conquering those cities? Did they grumble because we marched all this way to fight and now there's no fight? We dressed up for war and there's nothing to fight with? What was their grumbling about? We're not real sure. But the leader said, verse 19, we made a covenant with them. We swore by the Lord, we cannot touch them, but we will let them live. However, verse 21, they became hewers of wood and drawers of water. Okay? Now, that doesn't really register with us. How much firewood do you need in your fireplace for this winter? Okay, to think about that. One, how often do you use your fireplace? How many of us have a wood-burning fireplace? That eliminates some of us. Ours is gas logs. Okay, so how much wood do you really need, and how much of that fireplace do you use is for comfort, and how much of it is to heat the house? When I grew up, the fireplace pretty much heated the house. Now, we had a gas furnace too, but we saved on gas by cutting firewood. When my father grew up, if you didn't have a fire in the fireplace, you froze to death, because that was the only source of heat. And when his father grew up, you cut wood for the stove and for the fireplace. Okay, because that was before electricity was invented. So you back up in history, we've got to have wood for every meal we cook. They didn't have a microwave. There's no place to plug it in. So they didn't need one. So every meal they cooked, for breakfast, for lunch, for supper, they had to have firewood for every sacrifice. Bear in mind that there was a sacrifice put on the altar in the morning, and it cooked all day long. How much firewood you need? That night, they took that sacrifice off, and the priests ate that animal. And another animal was put on its place, and it cooked all night long. How much firewood you need? Now, in your tent, you're going to fix some kind of breakfast and some kind of supper. How much firewood you're going to need? And we're talking about an army of 600,000 people. And if these men aged 30 to 50 or 60 or so each have one wife and two kids, you got a host of people that are going to have firewood. How much water do you drink a day? Now, I know there's some people that measure it. I drink when I get thirsty. And the more thirstier I am, the more I drink. And I don't pay attention to it. I just drink when it's there. Okay? There's some people that actually take the time to measure it, and that's okay. I don't mind that. But how much do you drink a day? We don't think about it because we go to the fridge or the water faucet, turn it on, get the water, and go. How much water did you use taking your shower? Never measured it. Now, we notice when there's a bad leak and the water bill is sky high, but we don't really pay attention to how much water we actually use. How much do you use in cooking? I mean, if you're going to boil a lamb, A, you got to have a big pot. B, you got to have a lot of water. C, you got to have a lot of firewood. You put all that together, and these people of these few cities, they are made servants, or basically slaves, for the rest of their generations, plural. All the way down to the time of Solomon, they're still involved doing this. They have to bring all the water that's used for worship, all the water that's used for all the people in Israel. So all you had to do was say, hey, we need the bucket filled, and that was their job. I need to build a fire. Here's the firewood. They had to go get it. And it's not going out and picking up a few limbs. It's bringing in a lot of wood for all of Israel. So this is a pretty tough condemnation. However, Israel honored their oath. They let them live. But they made them hewers of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, verse 27 says, and for the altar of the Lord to this day. That is, to the day the book was written. So, why did Gibeon seek peace with Israel? Gibeon was a pretty good city. Well established, strong men, valiant warriors. We'll see this in chapter 10. Why make peace? And how make peace? So they made it by the deception, but they really were, what's the right word here? Scared. They were afraid for their own lives. And we kind of answered all these, and I've got all these in the Bible app. You can go back and find these later. We've answered that one. Let's see. Made them hewers of wood. What mistake did Israel make and Joshua make in all of this? They didn't ask God. They went through this whole process, and nobody said, you know what? Before we sign this treaty, we might all ask God about this. But they didn't. All right, chapter 10. And this kind of ties into the first couple of verses of chapter 9 about the nations joining together. It came about when Adonai Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai, utterly destroyed it just like he'd done to Jericho and its king, and so he'd done to Ai and its king, and that, get my page turned here, that I need to turn one page, not two. Y'all bear with me. Here we go. And the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within that land. He feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like a royal city. It was greater than Ai. All of its men were mighty. Therefore Adonai Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, the king of Hebron, to Piram, the king of Jarmuth, Japhia, the king of Lachish, and to Debir, the king of Eglon, saying, come up and help me, let's attack Gibeon. So he sends down to his buddies. Now remember, Canaan was inhabited by city-states. And you've got Canaanites living in the valley of the Jordan and on the plain over here, the plain of Sharon. You've had Hivites living in the hills of what we think of as Samaria. You got Hittites down here, Jebusites in Jerusalem, Perizzites in the lowlands over here, Hittites up here in this area. So you've got several different nations. They are not, what's the right word? They lived in the same area, but they didn't get along. There were constant battles from one city to another. And where these cities had kings, think of it more as governor or mayor of the city or the area. They were not king over the whole country, just king over the little city. And so these kings didn't get along together. But there's an old saying, that the enemy of my enemy makes my enemy my friend. We share a common enemy. Israel's attacking. You guys help me out. Let's put aside our differences and let's confederate together and fight against Israel. And so these four of the kings decide to join in. Now, you wonder what the scribbling is over on the wall. Jerusalem was the home of the Jebusites. And originally its name was Jebus. This is the Hebrew letter Beth, the letter B. And you add some other letters to it and you get Jebus. This is the Hebrew letter Rosh, or R. What's the difference? That one little line across the bottom. You take that line off, you change the B to R. So this city was actually originally called Salem. It was the home of Melchizedek, Genesis 14. Salem belonged to Melchizedek, who was a Jebusite king, priest and king at the same time. priest of the Most High God. So this Salem belonged to the Jebusites. There's another Salem, not on the map, that didn't belong to them. So to keep them apart, this is Jebus Salem. And over time, if we drop this letter, we've got Jerusalem. It's the same place. In fact, when David conquers it later, it's still called Jebus. But in time, the name was changed to Jerusalem, the Salem that had belonged to the Jebusites. Adonai Zedek was most likely a descendant of Melchizedek. Melchizedek means my righteous king. Adonai Zedek means my Lord the king. Adonai is the Hebrew word for Lord. So Adonai Zedek was probably not a worshiper of God like his ancestor Melchizedek was. Otherwise, he would not have fought against God's people. That would make sense. So, but anyway, Adonai Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, and get these other kings. So verse 5, the 5 kings of the Amorites. Now, they may not have all been Amorites. We speak of all the people who lived in the land as Canaanites. They were not all Canaanites. So we can speak of a lot of these people with the generic term Amorites, and that kind of covers the bill. So the 5 kings of the Amorites of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, all these cities to the south, they joined together and camped by Gibeon to fight against it, and maybe already engaged in the fight. Then the men of Gibeon sent a messenger to Jericho, or to Gilgal, to Joshua, and said, help! We're being attacked. And if we're conquered, you lose your servants. You said you'd let us live. Part of that deal is you got to help us out. How much time happened between this decision by Adonai Zedek? They get their armies together, they come together, they march, and they attack Gibeon. Gibeon, in the meantime, sends a message to Joshua and says, we need your help quickly. We're in trouble here. So verse 7, Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. The Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, I've given them into your hands. None of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. Now it took them 3 days to get there before. Now they get there all night. How come? Well, they're in a hurry. It's not but about 20 miles. The trouble is, it's uphill. Because Gilgal is about here by Jericho, is about 1,300 feet below sea level. Jerusalem's about 2,000 feet above sea level. Gibeon's in the same vicinity as far as altitude. It's still a pretty good hike. At night, uphill, in the dark, ponder that, and nobody had a flashlight. Now think about physically, you were smiling about the flashlight thing. Think about physically what that involved to make this trip. So how'd they come to the rescue of Gibeon like that? And why? Because of the treaty they'd made with them. Now, getting ahead of ourselves. What's remarkable about this battle? So they march all night to get there. Adonai Zedek and his forces did not expect that. And here's why. When we get to the fight with David and Goliath, we get kind of an insight into how they fought their battles. They would get up in the morning, fix breakfast, drink their coffee. About 9 or 10 o'clock, someone would holler, all right, line up. And all the army get up, and stretch out, get their swords and spears and shields and everything, and they go line up for battle. The other team would get on their side, lined up, and someone holler, sick 'em, and they go down to fight. Somewhere around noon, someone holler, lunchtime, and they quit. Pick up the dead and wounded, go back, patch them up, check on everything, eat a little bite of lunch. About 1 or 2 o'clock, let's do it again. So they'd fight a little while longer. Supper time, they quit. Everybody go back to camp. So this thing of going in and fighting, and by the way, we didn't see this as a battle of my arm, my sword, my shield, my spear, my army is bigger, greater than yours. It's my God is bigger than yours. That's how they saw this. They didn't see this as a power of my team's better. They saw it as my God's bigger. And so when they got up that morning, Joshua and Israel were there. And they're checking their calendar and said, wait a minute, how'd they do that? How'd they get here overnight? They weren't here yesterday. How are they here today? So that confounded them, plus the fact the Lord's doing some fighting here. So verse 9, Joshua came upon them suddenly. And verse 10, the Lord confounded them before Israel. He slew them with a great slaughter, God did, at Gibeon. Pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And they fled before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth-horon. The Lord threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those who the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Beth-horon is kind of an unusual town. It's basically two communities, one at the top of the hill and one at the bottom of the hill. And so we'll read later about doing something to the upper Beth-horon and to the lower Beth-horon. And there's kind of a valley that separates the two. And it's kind of a north-south valley that runs down towards Azekah down this direction. I can't find it on the map exactly here. So anyway, they're fighting here to the west side of Jerusalem. Mountainous region, hilly region. Again, Jerusalem's 2,000 feet above sea level, so you've got some pretty good mountains through here. It's not the rolling hills of Samaria, but higher mountains, a little more ragged, jagged, and it's a pretty treacherous route between upper and lower Beth-horon. In fact, there are places on the route that actually have cut steps into the rock to make it easier to go up and down. Or you can just take a piece of cardboard and jump on and slide down the hill, because it's pretty treacherous. But you read through here, the Lord was fighting too. He brought up a storm, and he was throwing hailstones, and he was more accurate with the hailstones than Israel was with the sword. So God was fighting in this battle. The battle apparently had waged for a while. So verse 12, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, O moon, in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. There was no day like it before or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua and all of Israel returned with him to Gilgal. Now, this passage, verses 12, 13, and 14, remember, Joshua, or whoever wrote this after the fact. And in their writing, this is inserted. And this poem that is quoted here is actually found in the book of Jasher, which is a chronicles of the battles of the leaders. That's about the best we can make out of it. It doesn't exist today. It's been lost in antiquity, but it's referred to several times in Scripture. And there are other books of chronicles that we do not have record of, and it's okay that we don't have it, but it was written, and they knew about it. It was in their public library. It was part of their public records. And so it was kind of an account that the scribes made of what the leaders of Israel were doing. So you've got one for David, for Saul, for Solomon, for other kings of Israel as you go down through the line. So this is quoted from that. But what happened? That the sun would stand still for about the length of a day. Now, in teaching this in high school, wait a minute. That means the earth has got to stop turning. Right. The fact that the earth turns on its axis causes gravity, and that's what holds us down. Right. So if the earth stops, we just float away, right? I don't know. I'm not a scientist. What happened? If, as we think, if the earth stopped turning, we're going to float off. Why didn't they float off? If you go and read about this, there's a lot of scientific jargon about all this. You know, we could actually hang on to the earth for a while. It's not the spinning that really is the gravitational force, and yada, yada, yada. The best way to explain this is God's in charge. I don't know what metaphysical, environmental, solar problems God had to deal with, but if He's the one who started all this, He can surely stop it, slow it down, or whatever. But whatever God did, it shook Him up and allowed Israel to fight for another nearly 24-hour period without the sun going down. Now just imagine some guy out there on the beach getting a suntan saying, you know what? That sun ain't moved in about 24 hours. I'll probably burn on this side. You think about that. And then thing caught me, when they're fighting, you're going to get hungry. Nobody hollered lunchtime. They picked up all the spoils as they went through camps. And they ate on the run. Fast food. They were not stopping to fix food. They drank at the brooks. They drank from whatever they found. And they fought, and I think God was giving them extra strength. Remember, they had marched all night. They hadn't slept. And I'm sure when this day was over, they slept. Had to. They're pretty tired. Because this was literally the longest day. So what God did in all this, that's His problem. We let Him handle that. But is there any scientific evidence that that happened? Years ago, there was a thing circulated that some astronomers or whatever realized that in all their calculations, there was a time frame missing. We're missing about a day. And then someone said, well, when God turned back the sundial of Ahaz 10 degrees for Hezekiah, and you add what happened here in Joshua 10, that adds up that extra day. That's a good idea. There's no real good evidence for that. There's too many things you got to know before that to make sure that that happened that way. I mean, it's a good idea. It's better just to realize that God's in charge of this universe. And He can stop it, He can start it. He can slow it down, He can speed it up. And He did. And that answers that question. We take that on the faith of our Scriptures. But is there any cultural evidence that this happened? Yes. This is the fun part. Other cultures throughout the world, I use this term very carefully here, non-biblically influenced cultures. Cultures where we think the Bible never got to. The deepest recesses of Africa, whatever that means. The darkest parts of South America, whatever that means. The Native American Indians. These cultures have a Tower of Babel story, a flood story, and a long day story. So other cultures in the world, I mean, when you stop the world for 24 hours or so, however long it was, 22, 24, the other people in the world are going to notice that. Can you imagine the school children? Is this day ever going to end? Can you imagine Mama looking at a watch? This kid's got to go down for a nap sometime this afternoon, and in the afternoon yet. I mean, honey, when are you going to have fixed supper? Well, it ain't nighttime yet. The cows always come to the barn at night. They're wondering, are we ever going to get to the barn? I mean, this affected the whole world. And these other cultures have records. Now, they don't accuse God of it. They accuse their gods of it, or somebody else's God. They don't relate it to the Almighty God, but there is evidence in these other cultures that this really did happen. This is not manufactured in the book of Jasher. But what effect did it have on the Amorites? The people of Canaan, primarily the Amorites, worshiped the sun and the moon. And when your God stops the sun and the moon, your God's bigger than my God. So this had an effect on them, a disheartening effect. How come our God's not letting the sun go down? Because when the sun goes down, we get to stop fighting. When the moon comes up, we get to stop fighting. And what's going on here? The battle is never going to end because their God is bigger than my God. And we lose. Now, these 5 kings hide in a cave at Makkedah. And in passing by, they're chickens. They realize they're whipped. So they get together and they go hide. And I'm sure it's not just the kings themselves. There were others involved. But they're hiding in a cave, thinking that the onslaught of the army will pass them by, but they get caught. And they're actually trapped in the cave. They put stones in front of the cave so they can't get out. Then they come back that evening, or maybe the next day. At some point, they come back to this cave, and they take the stones away, and they bring them out. Verse 20 of chapter 10. When Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished slaying them with a great slaughter until they were destroyed, and the survivors who remained of them had entered their fortified cities, all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace, and no one uttered a word against any of the sons of Israel. Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave, bring out these 5 kings." So they did so, brought them out, the king of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. When they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who gone with him, "Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings." So they came near and put their feet on their necks. You say, "Well, that's mean." Used to, when I was a kid, we watched the professional wrestling. The guy that lost was laying there on his back. The victor put his foot on his chest to hold him down. Raise his arms up like I've won. Okay, it was all a show. But what did that mean? It means I'm the victor. So to these kings, the leaders of Israel come up and they put their feet on them. We have won. And it's a lesson to all of Israel that God has fought for us today. And we symbolically put our feet on these men's necks to indicate that God gets the victory. Then, Joshua said, verse 25, "Do not fear or be dismayed, be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight." Guys, this ain't over. Yeah, we won today, but we got more. We got another game next week. Verse 26, "So afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death, hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. And it came about at sunset that Joshua gave a command that took them down from the trees, threw them into the cave where they'd hidden themselves, put large stones over the mouth of the cave. They're there to this day." Well, why hang them? Ain't killing them enough? Why kill them and then hang them? And then after hanging them, why take them down at night? If we leave them hanging overnight, whoever might be left that got to these fortified cities may come and rescue them and give them a decent burial. They don't deserve that. And 2, we hang them as a public notice, not just to Israel. There's everybody else in the country that needs to know this is what's going to happen. That's why when someone was condemned to die, they were stoned by everybody in town. So when they're hung, everybody in the country knew about it. In Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23, if someone does something worthy of death and you hang them, take them down at night. So by the law, that took them down and buried them like they did. All right, I'm running quickly out of time. So I'm going the wrong way. Here we go. There we go. After this, if you read the rest of the chapter here, they go to each of these towns of these 5 kings, conquer those towns, destroy them, defeat, kill all the people, and they basically, in this campaign, they take everything south of the country. They have already conquered Jericho, Ai, Bethel, set up the tabernacle or the altar at Shiloh, or excuse me, at Shechem. Now they've conquered the whole southern part of the country. When we read this, it looks like this happened just in a little while. This probably took several months, may have been taken a whole year. But after all of this battle, they go back and kind of camp down, settle back, maybe for winter in at Gilgal. What decisions? There are some questions that are stupid, right? This is one of them. Which decisions should we seek God's assistance on? Lesson number 1. Had Joshua asked God about Gibeon, they wouldn't have made that covenant. So which decisions that we have to make should we ask God's assistance on? Next, is there an ethical question to be learned from Joshua honoring the covenant with Gibeon? Yeah. It's a bad decision, a bad covenant, but they honored the covenant that they made. They were ethical in that. Now, there's probably a lot more we can say about that. I guess I need to announce it. We are in the Bible app. These questions are in the app. You can go there if you need some help, let me know. But in a couple of weeks, I'm not sure when, they're probably going to stop the live streaming of the class. That doesn't affect those of us sitting here, but those who are watching online, it does affect. Unless there's a serious rebellion about that, they're going to be doing that in the next couple of weeks. I need to get that word out. That's all for today. God bless you. Have a great week. We're dismissed.